So today we are again on the Mahayana section, or the apex of the pyramid um, of and the second volume, and we'll be talking mainly about the development and the importance of the development of compassion, and also we will be looking at the importance of developing equanimity in terms of our relationship with others. But before, let's set our motivation, and particularly again to think about using this time of reflection to reflect upon what's being said, and bringing that into our lives, and considering how to do that, and finding in ourselves a sense of responsibility towards the world, and likewise using that sense of responsibility to be determined to walk the path of enlightenment and possibly to become a Buddha in order to benefit everybody. Okay, so this motivation setting is very much what we're talking about right now, and again, likewise, as Je Rinpoche said last week, in the talk last week, is that we should try our hardest not to just let this be something we say before we do do any practice, but really we should be considering to think this way all the time. So this is the second chapter, and where Je Rinpoche really wants to emphasize the importance of compassion as the entrance to the Mahayana. So last week he suggested or explained why bodhicitta is the soul, bodhicitta being the mind set on full enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, is the only criteria for entering into the Mahayana, into the Mahayana, the path that leads us to full enlightenment. So Mahayana just means the great vehicle, the vehicle that leads us to the highest level of enlightenment, the Bodhisattva Buddha, the one who is able to teach where no teachers have been before, teach in this particular case in terms of the path to enlightenment. And this is the main quality that nobody disputes, that the Bodhisattva Buddha has, is this ability to teach where no teaching has been before, to turn the wheel of Dharma. So having talked about the fact that we need bodhicitta, what this mind of enlightenment, what Je Rinpoche wants to help us to do is to learn how to train ourselves to have that mind, because it's very hard to imagine it coming spontaneously or naturally. He mentioned earlier last week, he talked about how important it is for us to recognize the value of being a Buddha to ourselves in terms of being free of samsara, completely, irreversibly free of suffering, but also how we are able to, we have these special qualities. We have reached the finality of the path. There is no higher than a fully enlightened Buddha. And again, we are able to fulfill both our own needs and the needs of others. There are also many other benefits, such as being omniscient and so on. Having particularly the mind of a Buddha is known as Dharmakaya, the sphere of Dharma. And this is, it knows no bounds. So it's a wonderful state to be in, apparently. That's what we're working on, right? So Je Rinpoche wants to now say there are basically two approaches to the development of bodhicitta that are well-founded in terms of their lineage. One of them is from the lineage of a teacher who actually traveled by ship to Java to receive the teaching on bodhicitta from his teacher Salingpa. So bodhicitta, remember, is this intention to become enlightened to benefit all beings. Body is Buddha, citta is mind. When we have bodhicitta, then we are a bodhisattva. We're a being who is whose aim is to become enlightened for the benefit of all beings. So he says there's the Atisha Lingpa lineage, which is known as these the 6 cause 1 effect, or the 7 cause and effect personal instruction, and the other one is the training based upon Shantideva's work, the Bodhicharyavatara, which is also known as exchange self for others. Now, these two techniques are not contradictory. It's not as if one has to choose one or the other. In fact, in many ways, they are complementary. They work very well together to establish the body, the bodhicitta mind. On that journey, one of the aspects of this is we have to develop what is known as great compassion. So, and Je Rinpoche will talk about how important compassion is. And specifically, the compassion he's talking about is what's known as great compassion. So, although great as in big, large, the word great here specifically means to all beings without exception. So there's not a single exception in the past, present, or future for which we don't feel compassion. And I've attended talks and teachings given by many different people on this, and often the audience, especially Western audience, will say, well, that's just impossible. So what we're trying to do is to achieve what many people consider to be impossible. And this will give us, this methodology will give us the ability to develop this superpower, right? This impossible ability. If we actually train ourselves, we can develop this superpower. First of all, not necessarily very strong and not very continual, because we get distracted by things. But eventually we become more and more familiar with it until the point is that we are able to have this incredible loving kindness and compassion to everybody without exception. And it's like, in many ways, it is indeed a superpower. And this is what Je Rinpoche wants to talk about. So first of all, he's going to concentrate of these two traditions. He's going to talk very much about the Atisha's lineage one from Selingpa, the 6 cause and 1 effect. So he starts from the back end and he says we end up with this spirit of enlightenment. That's the effect, the bodhicitta spirit, the spirit of enlightenment from which perfect Buddhahood arises. And the cause of this in the 6 cause, the direct cause of this, is the resolve. So the resolve in this particular case, and he will go into much more detail, is the resolve to work towards benefiting all sentient beings using the best means possible. So, and the resolve itself arises from great compassion. So when we're able to feel and empathize with all beings, their suffering, in a very, very strong and coherent way, then what this strong compassion, this empathy, is our driving force to feel a responsibility to do something about it. Now, in Buddhism, the word compassion generally means an intention to relief from suffering. So it's not just a sense of sympathy or even I feel your pain, but actually the intention to remove that pain. So we can see quite clearly that once we have this great compassion, then we're going to want to take on the burden for it. And if we correctly identify Buddhahood as being the best way to do that, then of course we'll say, right, I need to be a Buddha in order to be able to do this. Compassion itself arises from love, and loving in this sense is a sense of cherishing. And again, we will need to develop a cherishing mind towards all beings without exception. And in this particular tradition, in this particular lineage, the way in which we develop that love for all beings without exception is through the wish to repay the kindness that all beings have given us. And this is done by recognizing that at some point or another, all beings have been our mother. So when we recognize or recollect their kindness as mothers, as those who love us without with sacrifice, if you like, or parents who are willing to sacrifice themselves, then that recollection brings this wish to repay them, and it develops this fondness for them, and that develops the compassion for them, and that develops the intention to this resolve to do something about it, and that leads to our Buddhahood. So those are the 7. So Je Rinpoche says he wants to really be quite certain about the order in which those steps are happening. And in order to do this, he wants to really explain how the root of the Mahayana path, of the path to Buddhahood, is compassion. And then how all of the others in this 6 cause 1 effect are either the causes of or the consequences of this compassion. So he then says, well, look, I want to really say that Mahayana is compassion in the beginning, it's compassion in the middle, and it's compassion at the end. So he's really wanting us to be clear about how important compassion is in terms of the Buddhist path, especially in terms of the Mahayana Buddhist path. So he says, in terms of compassion in the beginning, what Je Rinpoche says is that once we have this great compassion, we will definitely make the commitment to free all beings. And if we do not have compassion, great compassion, if our compassion is weak or it's incomplete, we won't. We will be picky about which sentient beings we want to enlighten if our compassion is not complete. And again, if we don't really feel that sense of compassion towards beings, then we won't feel the urge to do anything to help them. So clearly we need to have a strong, great compassion. And therefore, he says, compassion is important at the beginning because feeling responsible to free all beings requires this great compassion. And if we do not have it, we cannot be ranked as, if we don't have that bodhicitta, that mind for enlightenment, then we cannot be ranked as a Mahayana practitioner. And Je Rinpoche then cites sutra, the teaching of actually a Yamati Sutra, and he says, furthermore, Shariputra, Venerable Shariputra, the great compassion of the bodhisattvas is inexhaustible. Why? Because it is the prerequisite. So it's just as the breath is the prerequisite for the life of our human being, the great compassion of a bodhisattva is the prerequisite for correctly reaching the Mahayana, and in other words, of being a bodhisattva. And again, he cites the Gaya Sura, and he says, Manjushri, what is it that motivates the bodhisattva deeds? What is its object? And Manjushri responds, Devaputra, great compassion motivates the bodhisattva deeds. Its object is living beings. So then Je Rinpoche says it's the basis, compassion is the basis of engaging in the deeds, because when we see that we cannot live up to our commitment to Buddhahood without training the 2 vast collections, we set about the difficult work amassing these. So what we recognize is that becoming a bodhisattva and acting on the bodhisattva deeds, the bodhisattva deeds are made primarily of what are known as the 2 vast collections, which were briefly mentioned last week. And these 2 vast collections are the collection of wisdom and the collection of merit. So merit is doing good and having a very, very positive actions, and wisdom is the insight that pierces through ignorance and ceases the basis, the causes of samsara. So in this sense, we need such a great amount of both of these great collections of good deeds and insight, that it can be daunting, very, very daunting indeed, unless we have the great compassion which drives us to continue our path. So this is very much like the point of saying that what it is, the driving force to enlightenment is sort of basically a discomfort. And this discomfort is not caused by our own sense of samsara, but it requires our own understanding of the suffering of samsara. And it is when we understand the suffering of samsara that we experience, and we extend that to recognize that all beings in samsara similarly suffer, then we're able to feel a sense of, I'm not important here. I mean, yes, I'm important, but I'm just one of many, one of everybody who's in this mess. And the only way in which I can do anything to help everybody in this mess is achieve Buddhahood. So it's the suffering of all beings that is the driving force, is the discomfort that pushes us to continue our path and developing our path. Otherwise, if it were just our own discomfort, when we reach certain states of meditation and so on, then we don't feel discomfort so much. And also, once we've pierced insight and we've got a clear view of the universe as it is, selflessness, then again, discomfort in terms of our own suffering begins to retreat. Both in terms of right now, but also causally. And so we can lose, if you like, we could begin to lose our discomfort to continue the journey to full enlightenment. Therefore, we know that the full enlightenment requires a discomfort that will be retained throughout our entire path. So then Je Rinpoche says there's also the importance of compassion in the middle. So we know why we need at the beginning to set our motivation. He says, we might initially have a very strong spirit of enlightenment and engage in the deeds, but when we realize, and again, this is something I've just said, but he says, when we realize that living beings are innumerable, they're infinite or appear to be infinite, they're continually acting improperly, they're completely unable to do very much, they're filled with all sorts of strange convictions and views, they don't listen very well, they don't know how to listen very well, are very hard to train, even ourselves are hard to train, let alone all sentient beings. Many of them cannot hear or cannot meditate at all, and it's going to take an hour training itself is very, very difficult and limitless, just it continually limitless, and not only is our training limitless, but the ability to train others is also incredibly difficult and limitless. And we begin to realize that we need a very, very large, lengthy amount of time to generate these bodhisattva actions. And it's easy, therefore, to lose heart. However, if we customize ourselves with this great compassion and we keep it thriving, we keep it alive, and it's not just a one-time wonder, or a single meditation session that sets us in the first place, we become unconcerned with our own happiness or suffering. We become unconcerned with anything other than continuing our journey. And at no point are we discouraged in providing for others' welfare, even in the smallest way, as well as the largest way of actually committing ourselves to the practice. So we might find it easy as bodhisattvas to benefit others through medical health care, or from charity work, or all sorts of other things. And there's nothing wrong with this at all. But the best work in terms that we can actually deliver is transforming ourselves into Buddha. So literally becoming Buddhas. And that we do through accumulating these great collections of merit through doing the giving and the healthcare and all the other things, and also the wisdom, the insight that cuts through wrong view. So we do need to be aware of and not to denigrate compassionate acts that are a limited sense, but also recognize the benefits of the compassionate acts which are unlimited. And he says, therefore, because we have this great compassion and we're able to keep it alive and sustain it, we are able to easily accomplish these great collections because we remain driven. We remain on top. We remain on task, if you like. And he cites Kamalashila, who says in the stages of meditation, it's because bodhisattvas are motivated, moved by this great compassion, continual compassion, that bodhisattvas strive to be helpful to others without considering themselves. And he also says, and he cites, Kamalashila cites another sutra, a sutra who says, one who has great compassion will always take on a life of suffering and will always give up a happy life in order to help all beings to mature. So our own interests, our own self-interests become deeply diminished when we've developed great compassion. However, it is recognized this is extremely difficult to do. To develop great compassion is not easy. And it, of course, from great compassion comes bodhicitta, but great compassion itself, it is not easy. It is, as some people say, it looks almost impossible, or it looks completely impossible to many to achieve. So then Je Rinpoche says, well, what is the importance of compassion at the end? And Je Rinpoche says it's because of the great compassion that Buddhas have, the power of this great compassion, that these supreme bodhisattva Buddhas, even when have reached the goal of full enlightenment, they do not stay in a peaceful state. Unlike the other two types of Buddha, they do not remain in nirvana at all. They do not sit in nirvana, but they continue to work for the benefit of all beings while there are any beings left suffering. So without this compassion, without this driving force, then they would be like the other enlightened beings, just residing in nirvana. And Je Rinpoche then again cites Kamalashila's text. It says it's because Buddhas are imbued with this great compassion that they remain until the end of the universe, or the universe is, remain until there are no beings left who have not achieved liberation, regardless of the fact that they have achieved complete perfection themselves. And he also says, Kamalashila says, the sole cause of the non-abiding nirvana, the non-abiding means non-resting nirvana of the great Buddhas, is great compassion. So just on a little note here, there's a bit of a dispute between the Theravadan tradition and the Mahayana tradition, and the Theravadan Sravaka, also known as the Sravaka, or the listener tradition, and the Bodhisattva, the Mahayana tradition, in terms of the final state of a Buddha. So the Theravadins say that the non-abiding nirvana is only during the lifetime from the point at which a Buddha achieves nirvana to the point of his death, at which point he enters into parinirvana, or nirvana, which is a state, the final state. So the final state is a state of rest. And they say, therefore, that it doesn't matter if you're a bodhisattva, a Buddha, or a Pratyeka Buddha, or a Sravaka Buddha, the final state is this non-abiding nirvana where there is nothing, no being, no consciousness, no continuity of consciousness left. There is just a space, if you like. And the Mahayana traditions say that the non-abiding nirvana is not the final, is the final state. Non-abiding, the abiding nirvana, the state where you're still, is not the final state. And in fact, as soon as one achieves enlightenment in that life, as soon as one becomes a Buddha, one remains in a non-abiding state, continually till the end of beyond time, beyond space, until every single living being has become liberated. So this is why, in a sense, there is a distinction made in Buddhism between these traditions, where an understanding of how the final state of a Buddha is viewed. Now, within our tradition, we believe that Buddhas are active, not just during their one life, but other than that distinction, all the traditions are basically the same. So what that means is that for Mahayanists, ourselves, Mahayanists, we believe that Buddha lasts beyond for the rest of time, whereas the Theravadins and similar Sravaka practices say that the extent of the enlightenment of Buddha active is only during that one last lifetime. And that's why, in a sense, they say, because a Buddha, after he dies, he goes to the same state as a Sravaka Buddha, what's the point, spending 3 ages of a universe just for a single few years? It's like, it's not necessary. So this is just one of the ways in which this is distinguished. But for us as practitioners, I think what we can do is we can not worry about that too much, and to think about it saying, well, maybe Mahayana's right, maybe Sravaka's are right, but the Theravadins are right. Why don't we find out for ourselves, right? Rather than just accept one or another, we can find out for ourselves, and then we'll know the answer, right? Rather than just depend upon others for the answer, we can find out. But whatever we do, we can see that there's benefit in this path. So in terms of whether or not one tradition or another tradition is correct, it doesn't really affect us in terms of our own practice. So again, here, Je Rinpoche is citing, talk about compassion. We're going back to compassion. He's saying that Chandrakirti, this very, very important teacher of the wisdom tradition, he says that compassion alone is the seed of a conqueror's excellent harvest. So he's using this analogy of seeds and harvests and so on. A very agricultural analogy, and water for its development. So it is because compassion is the seed of the conqueror's harvest, and the water is the development of this compassion, therefore, at the beginning, I praise compassion. So then Je Rinpoche cites another sutra which explains in brief that of all the teachings, if there's one that you should know, that we should know, the one teaching we should know, it's great compassion. So great compassion, again, I would qualify, is compassion to all beings without exception. And he says the reason for this is whenever there is teachings available, and wherever there is great compassion, then the teachings will arise for those beings with great compassion, without doubt. So all the other benefits of the path arise from of the path of a bodhisattva arise from the quality of that great compassion being there. So, and then Je Rinpoche says, so when we begin to recognize just how beautiful and how central, and one can find many other routes to this, both through reason and through understanding of the path, the nature of Buddhism, but also through sutra and other texts. He says, when we recognize how key the compassion is to our path, the Mahayana path, then why on earth would we not hold the bodhicitta, the spirit of enlightenment, to be the supreme instruction? So he then cites an 11th, I think a 10th or 11th century Tibetan called Je Tsongkhapa, and he had gone to see Atisha, who was in Tibet at the time, and he said, I went and I talked to Atisha, And I asked for instructions. And all he said to me was, renounce the world, cultivate the spirit of enlightenment. And Geshe Dontompo, who was famous for being the primary student of Atisha, heard Janashung saying this, and he said he felt embarrassed that this man had sort of just brushed it off, and he said, "You received the ultimate instruction from the great teacher." And Je Rinpoche adds on this. It says, well, we can see Geshe Dontompa really did understand the core of the teaching. So, and in fact, Je Rinpoche went on to write the three principal aspects of the path, of which the first two are renunciation and compassion and bodhicitta, and then the third one is insight. So. Je Rinpoche says, this conviction can be quite hard to understand. It might be hard for us to be able to see just how important compassion is. And therefore, we actually need to work on it. And he suggests we meditate on it, we accumulate merit, we read further, we study more, and we do purification practice to help us see more clearly that how compassion is central to our path and to our spiritual life. So having said that, then Je Rinpoche wants to explain how, as he said he would, the 6 other causes and effects are related to this central compassion, which is in this list. And he divides that into the first 4 and the subsequent 2, because on this list from Salingpa, which is the first 4 are the recognition of all beings as our mothers or those who care for us, all the way up to the development of a loving kindness as being the causes of compassion, and then how likewise the resolve, this strong intention to conviction to work for the benefit of all beings, and the spirit of enlightenment are the effects of compassion. So of the first, the causes, Je Rinpoche says, if you consider again and again the sufferings of all living beings, we begin to develop a simple desire to free them from suffering, because we recognize them as suffering, and we want to do something to do that. He says, but in order to develop this attitude easily, strongly, and firmly, to make it powerful, it is definitely the case that first we should develop a cherishing sense, a sense of cherishing, and have an affection. So we should have a definite, strong affection. And then he says, we've got this thing where at present we can't, we feel we don't like seeing our friends suffering at all, and we can't bear it. But we're often really quite happy when we see our enemies suffering. And we're really completely indifferent to the suffering of others who we don't know, strangers, or those who have neutral feelings. We might hear of those, oh well, poor them, and that would be about it. So he's saying that if we look at it, why is it that we have this thing where we feel this compassion towards our friends who are suffering? We really want to help them. And he says this is because we're fond of them. He says, if you think about it, actually, it's our cherishing and our love towards them that makes us not want to want them to suffer. So he says, if we, when we cherish them even a small amount, then we're only able to bear their suffering slightly. But when we cherish them a lot, we really don't want them to suffer at all, even if they suffer just a little bit. But he says then also, when we see enemies suffer, not only do we not develop any desire to free them from any suffering, but you also think, may they not only be free from suffering, but may they suffer some more. And this is due to a lack of affection. And this reminds me of something I saw, a while ago of this thing where people say champagne to my real friends and real pain for my sham friends. So it's a sort of word game, but the idea is primarily this idea that we want to actually see our enemies suffer. And in fact, it's especially in this case where we have wars going on, that where we feel a sense of allegiance or alliance with one side or the other, even if we're only on the sidelines, then when we hear of the suffering of the one side, like, because right now there's, like, for instance, the Ukraine war going on, and we feel this, we hear, oh, Ukraine's done very well, and they've, managed to defeat the Russians here, and they've killed all this. It's like, yes, or it might be the other way around. If we're supporting Russia, we're like, oh no, that's just terrible. And then, of course, on the other side, it's like we feel, uh, and we're talking about people's lives and suffering that's going on. Either way, the suffering happening here, right? So it's very easy for us to see how our sense of cherishing, or our sense of kinship, affects the way in which we view their attention regarding suffering. So these sorts of things are things that we need to really be looking out for. So therefore, Je Rinpoche is only making a simple case. He's saying that therefore it's our lack of affection is commensurate with the pleasure of their suffering. And therefore he's saying that we can see, if we look at this, the way in which our sense of affection affects our sense of compassion, right? And he then, being explicit and going through the three that he set out, he says, and therefore not, for those who have completely neutral feelings, we don't really have any affection or lack of affection, and therefore we don't really feel bothered particularly by their suffering or their non-suffering. So he says, therefore, for us to develop that affection, we need to, for living beings, we want to cultivate the view that they are close to us, like friends or relatives, and typically within, especially in a generic sense, although there are always special cases, it's the mother who is seen to be the closest to us, and therefore being able to recognize all beings as our mothers helps us to feel a sense of cherishing. And by recollecting their kindness and developing a wish to repay their kindness, we develop this very strong sense of affection and cherishing, which leaves us to a love that considers all living beings to be beloved by us, just as a mother considers her only child, or a mother who loves her child. And this love is what gives rise to that compassion. So briefly, on top of what Je Rinpoche is saying here, is that we can do this likewise, although we'll go into more detail about mothers, but we can also do this thing of saying, when we recognize from a scientific point of view that actually all beings, all living beings, are our relatives. Every being on the planet arose from a single ancestor. And this is accepted by science. There's no doubt about this. So all beings are our cousins. And then taken from, for instance, one of the aspects of the Vinaya is to recognize that those who are younger than us are like our children. Those who are about our age are like our brothers and sisters. And those who are older than us are like our parents. So we can, if we want to, if we find it hard to sort of identify as all beings as being our mother, which is not at all unusual from a Tibetan point of view because of rebirth, we can apply the same sort of approach of developing this very strong, cherishing mind towards wishing to repay and to honor our elders, regardless of whether or not they're our parents, and likewise a strong sense of paternal, maternal care and attention towards all of those who are younger than us, and likewise a sense of support and recognition and benefit to those who are same age as ourselves. So regardless of age, we can find a way of being able to develop loving kindness, to develop a cherishing mind, and this itself then helps us in our goal. So then we'll carry on from here. So then the causal relationship. So we talked about the causes of compassion. It says the relationship between compassion and the love that is the wish for beings to have. So he's now talking about the specific thing here. He says the relation between compassion and the love that is the wish for beings to have happiness is not definite. And he says, therefore, what we have is these recognizing all beings as our mothers in this case, recollecting the kindness and wishing to repay the kindness are the basis for both that love the love to bring happiness, but also for the basis of the compassion that wishes them to be free from suffering. So it's if you like, he's explaining the reinforcing nature of these steps in order to provide us with that compassion that we're looking for. And he said, you know, Shantideva, Salingpa and Atisha are not alone in this. He also mentions Chandragoma and Kamalashila, who come from completely different groups, and they all say that cultivating the view that living beings are our friends and our relatives is the cause of developing the spirit of enlightenment. So these views, this idea, this perception, or this perspective of being able to reach where we can value and feel kinship for all sentient beings is, if you like, the entry point, the beginning entry point for us to develop that superpower. Yeah. So without it, it's going to be very, very tough indeed. So then there's a question saying, well, you know, is it not enough for us to wish to become enlightened for the sake of all beings? Why is it necessary to have this wholehearted resolve between the compassion and the spirit of enlightenment? So the question is on regarding this resolve, the idea that I must resolve. And Je Rinpoche says, look, this resolve is about saying, I will shoulder the burden of responsibility. I will accept that responsibility for every single being without exception. And he said, you know, all enlightened beings, it doesn't matter, not just the bodhisattvas, all enlightened beings have this love and compassion, thinking of if only all beings could be free from suffering and have happiness. But it's the distinction is this: I myself will make sure this continuum, this mind, however long it takes, I will take on the burden of responsibility for providing the happiness of all living beings. That is exclusive to the Mahayana. And likewise, obvious, or maybe not obviously, that is then related to that the only way that I can do that is as a Buddha. So if we don't have a strong view, we don't understand the ability or quality of a Buddha, then we are unable to achieve the mind that wishes to become a Buddha. And therefore, we would fail in arriving with bodhicitta. And what happens in that case is we can still have that wholehearted resolve, this wonderful mind of great compassion, but it would be moved into politics or into medicine or into something else. So it's recognizing the ability of a Buddha who can actually permanently relieve beings from all suffering, that qualifies it as being a spiritual Mahayana path rather than it just being a superpower, great compassion. And he then uses this rather like a story about a householder has only one son, and everybody loves the son. He's attractive, intelligent, able, and everybody sort of falls in love with this son. It's very, very enjoyable. But because he's young, he's playful and careless, he falls into a shit pit. A pit of filth is what it says here, but basically an open cesspit, right? A shit pit. And all the relatives and friends notice he's fallen in, but it's like, he's up to his neck in shit and piss, and they cry out and lamenting and grieving, but they don't go in. They won't go in because they are because of the shit. So, but when the boy's father arrives, he sees the son there, and without any hesitation or any sense of revulsion whatsoever, he goes into the shit pit, gets hold of the boy, and brings him out. Now, the story is done in that sense, but it works just as well with whichever gender. It's not a gender-based story. It's just a story about how somebody is willing to go in and do something about it, where others would not. And just to be clear about the analogy, the shit pit, or this pit of filth, represents samsara. The child represents living beings, and the relatives who would not go in represents the Sravaka Buddhas and the Pratyeka Buddhas, the solitary and hearers. But it is the Bodhisattva Buddha, and also the Bodhisattva, who is willing to go into that shit pit and rescue that child. So this specific thing is the resolve to do something about it, to shoulder that responsibility to help. And he then, now Je Rinpoche makes the point that I've been making, which is that when we intend to liberate all beings, we begin to realize that in our current condition, our current predicament, we cannot fulfill the aims of a single being. We might be able to make them a bit healthier, we might be able to make them a bit wealthier, we might be able to bring some peace to them, but we will not be able to fulfill the aim in terms of eliminating suffering and the cause of suffering from their mind. And therefore, we're not able to liberate them. And therefore, if we think to ourselves, who can fulfill both the temporary and also the final aims of limitless sentient beings, we come to the conclusion that only a Buddha has this ability. And that will give us this desire to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. So this is how it works. Now, in terms of again, from the Theravadan tradition, they would say, yes, but it's only for a life. And Mahayana tradition, who is not going to argue with the Theravadan about how long a Buddha lasts, will say it doesn't matter if it's a life or infinite time. The fact is that the only way in which we can turn the wheel of Dharma where there is no Dharma is as a Bodhisattva Buddha. So then Je Rinpoche moves on into considering the actual step-by-step development of the 7 cause, 1 effect. And he starts off, and this is actually shared with both the 7 cause, 1 effect and also Shantadeva's method of exchange self and others, which we'll be dealing with later on, as saying that the one quality that we must have before we can begin to train on recognizing the familial nature of all beings is impartiality. So without impartiality, we have the problem of the without exception part. We might feel bias and partial in terms of the way in which our love is, and this is our normal state. So our normal state is to have a partial bias towards some beings and away from others. And in order to develop this superpower, the first quality we must, the first sort of aspect of our minds that we must eliminate or begin to eliminate and work on eliminating is this partiality. We must develop this impartiality. And this is something that's been raised by many friends about, for instance, things to do with location, both in time but also in space, how easy it is for us to ignore somebody who has fallen down on the ground in a city where we are not, let's say Los Angeles, where I am not, I'm in London, or Delhi. They may be fallen on the ground and hurting, but if they fall outside on the ground in front of my house, I might want, and I'm there, I might want to pick them up and help them. So we have this idea of not just closeness in terms of our relationship, but also in terms of space. And what we need to do is to develop this impartiality, regardless of where they are or who they are to us. So Je Rinpoche then explains to us, saying, well, we have to develop this even-minded attitude, eliminating this bias which comes from attachment to some beings and hostility to others. Otherwise, our love and compassion will feel, our love and our compassion will be biased, and if it's biased, then it is impossible for us to achieve great compassion, which it reaches to all beings without exception. So I remember when I first heard this, I thought that I had to somehow comprehend infinite, or and every single individual infinite and sentient being, and that became a sort of a maths problem for me, which was typical intellectual response to emotional relationships, developing an emotional meditation. But in fact, it's like it's not to do with having to encompass the entire universe and develop a working continual relationship with all beings all the time. Instead, it's dealing with anybody who I come into contact with, right? So regardless. So my intention is, it doesn't matter who arises, who comes into the sphere, who I think about, who I read about, what I hear about. Any type of contact doesn't have to be personal, direct, it can be over the TV, whatever. When I think about them, then my feeling is loving kindness, familial compassion, right? So that is the quality we're looking for. We don't have to be mathematical. We're just dealing about those that we have some contact about. So Je Rinpoche then explains there are different types of impartiality, but what we were particularly interested in is this immeasurable impartiality, and of which there are two types itself. That which wishes that all beings were free from having this attachment and hostility to other beings, and the other one is having this even-mindedness ourselves, having become free of attachment and hostility towards all beings. And he says the one we're interested in this particular case is this last one. So we're not talking about just wishing for others. What we're trying to do is to achieve this impartiality in ourselves. So there are different ways, there are many different ways of working on achieving impartiality. And Je Rinpoche mentions those which are intuitive and simple for us to accept. So one of them is, it's often very easy for us to be impartial towards somebody who we don't know, for whom we have neutral feelings. So he said often it's like, let's take such a person who has neither helped us nor harmed us, who is just a general person, and then we develop this even-mindedness, and we have no sense of hostility and no sense of attachment, grasping. So attachment here doesn't mean cherishing, it means grasping at, wanting to hold, not wanting to let go. The sort of relationship where we feel jealous if we see somebody else interacting in a way that we feel threatened, our relationship feels threatened by. So that's what we're talking about in terms of this attachment. And hostility is like, I prefer not to be in the same room as this person. Yeah. So I only want to be in room, I don't want anybody else to be in this room with this person, is attachment, and I don't want to be in the room with this person is hostility. Yeah. So, somebody neutral is like, I don't mind if they're in the room or not, right? So this is what he's saying. So once we've been able to, if you like, fulfill this imaginary room with all of these lack of these people who we don't know or don't have any strong sense of attachment or hostility through, and we feel quite comfortable with them being there in this mental room, if you like, or this environment, we can then begin to start thinking about developing even-mindedness towards our friends. So we in order to do this, we've got to recognize that our lack of even-mindedness is either because of the degree of our attachment for them, or because of our own bias arising from this attachment. So he's saying that basically having kind thoughts is fine, but actually wanting to be attached to them, like or threatened by their absence, or threatened by other people interfering in the relationship, this is no good. So he says, then once we've been able to achieve an even-mindedness towards these friends or our friends, then we also try to cultivate an even-mindedness towards our enemies. And he says again, this lack of even-mindedness is due to our hostility, viewing them as totally disagreeable to us or whatever. And then once we have managed to get these three, the neutral, the friends, and the enemies, then we extend that to all beings and say, well, there is no being who is anything other than these three in this particular case. So the way in which we're sort of cutting the world is to those who we into three groups, and therefore we can say, well, if this is true of my friends and this is true of my enemies, then it's true for all beings, right? So this way is a way of doing it. And he says, yeah, well, okay, hang on. That is the question. What meditation eliminates attachment and hostility? You say, oh, well, just eliminate attachment and just eliminate hostility. This is really not easy. All you're doing is sort of like shifting the goalposts. And Rinpoche says, well, look, there are actually a few methods for this. So one of them is, there are two methods mentioned by Kamala Shila. One of them is we can look at it from every point of view, from all beings' point of view. Everybody wants happiness and nobody wants suffering. So this is something that His Holiness Dalai Lama uses a lot in his talks. Therefore, he says, it's really inappropriate to hold some close and to help them while keeping others at a distance from harming them. Because if we look at it from the overview, we're all the same. Right. So this idea primarily here is coming as is because we're all the same. Why the fact that we hold some close and wish them happiness and hold some hostile and wish them misery, there's no sense. It doesn't make any sense. They don't want to be miserable. They don't want, they don't want to be miserable. They want to be happy. They want to be happy. So why are we making this arbitrary decision there like that? And he says again, another one is, from my point of view, if we don't want to look at it from their point of view, from my point of view, I've continually been reborn again and again since beginning this line. All beings have been my friends hundreds of times. And all beings have been my enemies hundreds of times. So why should I be attached to this one and not that one and not that one? And why should I be hostile to this one and so on? So when we're looking at this in terms of, again, we're looking at, I mentioned location, not just in space, but also in time, it becomes quite clear that our attachment to hostility is arbitrary. It's actually just based upon what we're aware of at the moment, rather than anything else, nothing deep, nothing substantial, just essentially where we are at the moment. And Je Rinpoche says, and also remember, when we were talking about the 8 sufferings in the previous volume last semester, he said, or 6 sufferings rather, the is the fact that friends and enemies are unreliable. They change all the time. They change even in our own lifetime. Somebody who's our greatest friend can become our greatest enemy, and vice versa. Somebody who we don't like, we can end up marrying. So these sorts of things are completely arbitrary and only local. So we've got to be a bit aware of the fact that we let our minds run away with what's happening right now, and we tend to forget what happened last year or last week. And so in that sense, we need to really consider when we're trying to establish our meditation that I need to be more universal in my approach. for these powerful meditations, I need to let go of my immediate concerns. I have to think about the bigger picture, right? So I do it gradually. So start off gradually, not necessarily too big, but what we're working on is to gradually develop this impartiality. And at the same time, if we like, we're to extend this sense of relationship, sense of kinship, sense of affection. So we don't want it affection which is grasping. We're looking for this sense of affection and trust, right? Trust in the others, no jealousy, no attachment, no grasping, no lust, none of this, right? No hatred, no disappointment. The point about it is to have this sort of strong neutral attitude. We need to work on it. It doesn't happen easily, but when we work on it, this helps us to achieve these. This is like the ground state, the starting state, where we have this impartiality, and on the basis of that, we can then develop this sense of loving kindness that we see with people like His Holiness Dalai Lama, and is absolutely awe-inspiring. It's available to us, right? He used this text. He used the Lam Rim. He used it for his own practice. This is the text that he used to develop that mind. It didn't come to him naturally, right? So for us, we need to also think, okay, I want to be able to develop this sort of superpower of loving kindness towards beings, this strong sense of infinite compassion, a great compassion, right? It's called infinite compassion, not because we have to imagine infinity, but because there is not a single exception where our compassion is not reached. Yeah. And he cites, he says, formerly I have killed you, all of you, and you have slashed and dismembered me. All of us have been mutual enemies and killed one another. So how could we be attached? So he uses this as an example of how to cut our attachment. And likewise, one has a similar verse for how to remember that all of our enemies were also our mothers and kind, and so on. He doesn't mention it here because he'll mention it in a bit. And likewise, he says, this way we can eliminate our attachment and our hostility, and as we towards human beings, towards sentient beings anyway, and as we do that, we then also begin to lose, in fact, all sorts of things. We begin to also lose this sense of fear. We begin to have a strong sense of kinship and so on. But also, and this is important, he says, I'm not saying that you need to let go of the fact that somebody is an enemy or somebody is a friend, but our relationship, our attachment and hostility to that person. So this is the way in which we deal with it. So we don't have to imagine that everybody is my friend and everybody is not my enemy, or the other way. I don't want to have any friends. I don't want to have any enemies. It's actually more to do with saying, I don't want to have any attachment. I don't want to have any hostility, right? So these come. We saw this right at the beginning in the 10 non-virtuous actions: attachment and hostility. Right there, one of the three, right? So along with wrong views and so on. So these things here, we're saying now, because we're weakening them, because we're practicing, because we're developing this lack of hostility, this lack of attachment, we can then begin to enable that, use that to empower our minds to establish these incredible states where we are free of attachment towards all beings. And then that gives us the basis of establishing impartiality. And on the basis of impartiality, we're able to develop love and affection. On the basis of that, we're able to develop compassion. On the basis of that, we're able to achieve bodhicitta. On the basis of that, we're able to achieve enlightenment, right? Buddhahood. So this is available to us, right? It's not sort of mysterious or mystical. It's available as we can see it, reason and understand it. Anyway, I think we'll stop there today. Okay, so let's dedicate any merit today to towards doing our best to work towards a state of an impartial mind, towards a sense of cherishing, to recognizing a sense of kinship towards all beings. That's a very good start. For the purpose of becoming Buddhas, yeah, of enlightenment, and then next week we'll be covering developing the actual 6 cause and 1 effect. So this one was just the preparation work for both types of development of bodhicitta, this sense of impartiality. And so let's now just do our best to meditate. Maybe meditate on that, developing that impartiality according to Je Rinpoche's instructions, or just the breath, as you like. Otherwise, see you next week.